Can you talk me through a scenario that would cause Bristol house prices to drop by 10%? So talk me through what could happen that could cause that to happen.
I think when you see huge spikes in any market, it's usually an external factor of some significance, that causes that. I can't see a situation where it's suddenly going to go down by 10% overnight, unless it's one of these huge events like a recession or a war or something like that significant knocks all confidence out of the marketplace. So, if there is a reduction in price. So in London at the moment, prime central London, we are seeing a reduction in capital values, but it's only by 2 or 3%. To get to 10% is a seismic shift. I don't know how everyone else feels about that.
Yeah, I think there would have to be a significant economic event for that to happen. Outside of that, I'm not really sure what it would be.
No, I mean, even if Bristol found a way of building another 20, 30,000 properties, in brownfield land or on the outside of Ham Green or something like that, I still don't think that's enough supply of property to bring the pricing down significantly because there's such a huge demand for property.
I'm interested from the questioner what inspired that. Is that if this could happen, I don't want to be entering the buy-to-let market?
No, just generally, property pricing up for a long time now, but if you do any sort of financial reading, you're always told these things are cyclical, and eventually they will go down again. It's the nature of things. And you're always trying to predict when that might be or what might cause it. So, I mean, I'm not old enough to know really why it's previously crashed, apart from 2008. That, again, was mainly only in some areas of the country. So I was intrigued to see what you thought, if you had to blue sky think sort of thing, think of what could cause a crash, just so, be realistic.
I think generally, if you it goes back to a lot of the things that have been answered earlier. If you're buying a property for the long term, so let's call it 20 years, during that 20 years, you will see fluctuations in house prices. But generally, the trend in the UK is at the end of that 20 years, that fixed period, house prices generally have been greater than from the point at which you started. So not the only way, but a scenario where you could lose money, I guess, is if you sold your property in some sort of dip. And that's sort of what happened in the 1990s when interest rates went through the roof and you had people with negative equity. There are a lot of things in place at the moment when people go to first borrow money that sort of help negate some of that.
Good question. And yes, lady here.
There's been a lot of talk about the shortage of new build property, i.e. the shortage of property per se. And that's been the situation for a number of years. My understanding is this year, the actual, certainly new properties available on the market or new builds have actually gone up this year. The trend is increasing, albeit it's still very slow. What is the panel's view of government's mission on this, if you like? What's its view on ownership of property? Is it driving to try and make that easier for first-time buyers? Or what's its attitude towards private rental as opposed to institutionally backed rental business? So all those things we're talking about, what is the market going to do? My view is that if the government suddenly decides it's going to pump a load of money into building property, government-backed, then that might in itself have an impact on how people view property prices going forward. I'd be interested in the panel's views on those things.
Should we start with Martin?
Right. There is obviously a demand for property. From a government point of view, they talk about trying to free up land for development. It's a slow process, and the developers generally have a number of issues they have to deal with. One of them is actually from a point of view of materials and labour to build them in the first place. So in terms of numbers of units coming to the market, it won't be a sudden, a tremendous influx of new properties coming to the market. You have a lot of issues which the government may wish to have more properties built, but they don't make it particularly easy, both at a national level and also a local level. Legislation and the planning really slows things slows things down, sometimes for the good, particularly if you live local to a building site. You may not want to have a building site developed. But from a point of view of the developers, they do want to build properties and they want to build as many as they can. The affordable issue that you've mentioned, from a historically speaking, since the collapse of the market in 2008, one thing the government did do, which has helped the market both for first-time buyers and the developer as well, was the Help to Buy scheme, which actually a lot of units are still sold today and will continue to do so as long as the scheme's there, helping the first-time buyers onto the property ladder. And that scheme probably has been one of the most successful government initiatives to help buyers. It has its downsides, of course, but on the whole, it's difficult to predict where the future is. Everyone is talking about more units being built, and from the amount of potential developments coming through the pipeline, that should happen. How it affects prices, I don't think they'll ever build enough to actually cause prices to change.
I think historically speaking, there was a time when local authorities, housing associations built 150, 180,000 units a year, as well as private sector, 150, 180,000 a year. And I think new starts for housing associations have gone right down to 15, 20,000, which is still woefully inadequate. My own personal view is I think we should have an absolute position of tenure across the UK to give people choice in their tenure, which enables people to have social mobility as well. And I'm very, very positive about that. Some of the European models we need to be looking at. There's a lot of drive and push at the moment on build-to-rent schemes coming into the UK, which is very, very positive, backed by institutions as well. We're starting to work in some of those areas. I think, without being political about it, but you have to be, one of the key issues the UK has got is that we have a government that's in place every 5 years and then housing policy changes. What good would look like is a cross-party housing policy that lasts for 15, 20 years, that isn't political. We take the politics out of housing and we provide an all-tenure cross-party housing provision. Whether that will ever happen is another matter, but I think that's what we need.
Thank you. There was another question. Yes, sir.
Sorry. Just leading on from the last question, has the panel thought about taking into consideration the amount of offices which have been converted to residential under the permitted development rights legislation, which has started, I think, back in 2013?
Well, Martin specifically has been involved with a lot of those schemes. But from a commercial property point of view, there's a lot of cities in the UK that we've had vacant office space for years and years and years and years, and business trend has tended to be away from that space. And in a positive way, a lot of that accommodation has been converted into residential. The quality of some of those conversions are sometimes interesting, Martin, but it has brought more units back into the marketplace for residential in the central areas.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what the question is. You see it as a good thing or not a good thing?
In terms of the supply, a lot of these things are coming on stream now. A lot of my understanding is that they got the planning initially under the PDR legislation, then they've gone back to the planners to get more enhanced schemes. Yeah. So in fact, a lot of these things are only just coming on stream rather than back maybe a year or 2 years ago.
Yeah, the scheme was extended due to popular demand, as they say, because there was a time limit on it. It's actually quite interesting because within Bristol, the commercial units, there's a shortage of good quality commercial units, and I must admit I was looking at a number of development opportunities which were subject to planning for business use, and then a lot of people came in saying, actually no, we're going to build resi here. But actually it's gone full circle, and now some of the very big developments, because of the demand of commercial, they've gone back to planning to actually put it back to commercial again. But in some of the secondary locations, particularly, I've recently just completed a project about nearly 50 units in fish ponds locally. Most of them have gone to first-time buyers. It was a multi-storey block which frankly was pretty ugly. They've enhanced it. it looks a lot better now, and there's been most of them sold off plan, and that was post the Brexit issue, which I know we've talked about, and post the stamp duty issue as well. So it depends where it is, and frankly, some of the things I've seen aren't very nice in terms of architecture, but it's about affordability, and some of these schemes are sold at a bit of a discount in comparison to the residential market locally. So you pay your money and take your choice, really.
Thank you. I'm going to move on because we've got lots of questions. Yes, here.
Good evening. You alluded to foreign investment in London and other areas in the UK. Are there any restrictions on foreign companies purchasing residential properties in the UK?
Pass.
No, the only thing you just need to be aware of, obviously, is the ATED charge, which is an annual tax that does affect foreign companies from owning property in the UK. There's an additional taxes they have to pay each year. That's been in for a few years now. So that does affect if anyone is buying a residential property outside of using a foreign company. So there's additional charges, for those particular people.
That was a quick one. Okay, so over there.
My question is in relation to first-time buyers. Where would you say the best place is to buy a residential property?
Why would a first-time buyer buy a property? That's probably got something to do about where they live and work. Most people would actually want to buy for some reason, which is nothing to do with the property, more to do with their life. So in terms of giving you sort of a sound answer on this, I can't, because everyone's different.
Yeah, I mean,
but
just to
but
help
maybe
out
I'm
on
missing
that.
the point here.
Yeah, no, I mean, in Andrew's geographical network, there's certain areas that are south of Bristol. I mean, Midsummer Norton is one that comes to mind, which actually is an excellent location and has very affordable, 2-3 bedroom accommodation. I wouldn't want to give you a precise figure, but certainly under 250,000, you can find good 3-bedroom accommodation within, very good commute distances from Bath and Bristol.
I guess the question is that if you're a first-time buyer wanting to get onto the market, it's where's the most reasonable location you can find to get your first step on the ladder in a generally good area. And I'd say that most of the suburbs around Bristol are quite commutable, but are a sound long-term base, really. But I think you sometimes have to compromise. It's making a compromise sometimes, going to a different area to get onto the ladder for your first property, which is where I think you're probably coming from. So.
Thank you. Okay, yes, there.
Just a slight change in tack. Could you tell me, could the tax advisor explain whether the stamp duty premium applies to development land for building purposes, or secondly, agricultural land for rental purposes?
The new stamp duty rules apply to residential property that you're buying, and if at the end of the day you own more than one residential property, then there will be an extra tax to pay, the extra 3%.
And that will apply to agricultural as well as development land?
Depends what type of property you're buying. Because obviously if you're buying a residential property, then there will be the extra charge. So if you're going to be buying a farmhouse, it will be a residential property. Obviously, if you already own a property, then that's in the realms of, is there an additional charge? But if you're, say, maybe moving from one location to another and replacing your family home, and it just so happens that you're moving and you're buying a farmhouse, that would be a replacement of your main home, so it wouldn't be
no, I was thinking as additional property.
It would apply for residential property.
Thank you. We've got one actually that's come via YouTube, which is about tax, Karen. So while we're talking about tax, would a limited company be advisable for someone who has income from the EU and has to top up with UK tax contributions?
Like I say,
put you on the spot.
Put you on the spot, yeah. Like I say, the use, for some particular people, there is a benefit to having a limited company with a residential property, and obviously every situation is different. The reason why people are looking more so now at having limited companies compared to, say, 2 years ago is the fact that there is this mortgage interest restriction coming in from next April, which currently doesn't apply if you're in a residential property in a company. Whether that will change, I don't know. So people are looking at that as a way of maybe, in their eyes, putting themselves back in a position where they're getting full relief still for their mortgage interest. And if you do have quite a few properties, as I was discussing with someone in the audience before we started, the change in legislation coming can affect your net income quite significantly, and somebody who's potentially highly geared with a few properties could actually see it costing them to actually own these properties. So there is quite a lot of big change coming. Whether the best thing is to set up a limited company and move those properties is a completely different question. That really
We've got another one from YouTube, which is also about stamp duty. So we'll come back to that in a minute. Meanwhile, back to the audience in the room. If there were some more questions, I think. Yes, over there.
You mentioned about new builds and how many were coming on stream. Is there anywhere, like a website or something, where you can find the number of applications for new builds and the number of completions of those new builds by region?
Yes, I mean, certainly every local authority will have a planning website which will have listed weekly the planning which is being passed or refused, and that will give you the numbers of dwellings that are involved with each site. So if you, for the sake of argument, if you want to look at Baines, you literally type in Baines planning and it will direct you straight to the website, and you can see what's happening in the area. Same for Bristol, or any local authority will have a website.
Okay, I'm going to ask this other one. This is quite specific, but quite interesting. We're a college in Gloucestershire purchasing property for students to renovate and get work experience. Is there a stamp duty levy that applies? So I presume that the point of the purchase of the property is in order to give these students work experience, but one imagines that at the end of it there'll be a rather nice property.
Yeah,
which will be used for something else. But
it also depends on what entity is buying the property. As an individual,
I think it's a college by the sounds of it. The college is investing.
So there may well be specific exceptions maybe for colleges. It depends if it's run as a charity, possibly there could be an exception. Depends how they're going to be structuring it. But ultimately, at the end of the day, if they're going to be buying a residential property and obviously using it for renovation, there will be tax implications, not only on the initial purchase, but also on the eventual sale as well.
So they need to go and see their tax advisor.
Yeah.
Good. Okay, anybody else? Yes.
I've noticed in the last sort of 6-9 months that a number of high-end value properties, in new build properties in the centre of Bristol, including around the harbour side, don't seem to have sold. Do you think that's to do with Brexit, or is that to do with those properties being overpriced?
From my perspective, the market was changing, if you want to call it that, pre-Brexit. Probably over the last 12 months, there's been a slightly change in emphasis in the market, generally speaking. That hasn't translated through to price changes, but if you take each level of the market, there are differences in the speed of things selling. And what has changed, particularly as far as new developers are concerned, is that generally up to about a year ago, everything sold off plan just like that before they're even built. Now we're in a different market to a certain extent, although not, it depends again on what level you're looking at in the price range. There has been, people are taking their time to buy. It could well be that the ones you're particularly looking at are overpriced. I'm not sure which ones you're talking about, and I could obviously pass my own personal point of view and judgment on those. If they're not sold, it is a question that maybe the developers have put them a little bit optimistically high. But obviously I can't comment on individual units. What you will find, unlike a market of a year ago or so, is that it's perhaps at the top end of the market become a bit more of a buyer's market, where you can actually go in and make offers. A year ago or more, you'd be probably paying more than the asking price because you'd have several people chasing after it. So there has been a change, and the market generally is, particularly at the upper end of the market, a little bit more sensitive. But it's not to say things aren't selling, because they are. It's just that sometimes if you're thinking of buying an upper end market property, you should perhaps, if it's been sat there a little while, think about making an offer.
What value is upper end?
There's a question.
What value do you think is upper end? I mean, it's a matter of opinion based on...
Asking you because you're the expert.
It depends. It depends in some respects what area you're talking about. If you're talking in prime London, you'd be looking at several £1 million. If you're talking... it's a difficult one to answer from a personal point of view. Probably 500 plus. You'd say 600. Okay. That's a personal point of view.
Okay. Thank you. So, yes, lady here, you had a second question.
What is the panel's view on more regulation on tenancy, on let properties? I know there's been, the immigration checks and bits and pieces. Does the panel see any further changes in legislation coming at us that we should be aware of?
Paul, should we start with you on that one?
Yeah. I think this harps back to an earlier question. I think the government have... One of the reasons for a lot of the legislation was to slow down the buy-to-let market. And I think my view is that they've probably slowed it down more than they would have anticipated. So I think with the current government, my view is they are unlikely to change too much at this point in time. And when you get the autumn statements, I would be surprised if there was anything in there that adversely affected further the buy-to-let market. That's where I think things are. I can't remember the exact figures, but I think the government looked to slow down the market by 20%, and I think they're way beyond that number already. So, and we've still to feel the effects of some of the changes to come in, aren't we? You know? So I think we're probably at the limits of where it is. I could be wrong, but that's what I think at the moment.
David? Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, the only two things I'm aware of in government being debated at the moment, really I don't think will affect people too much. So it's mandatory testing on electrics within rental properties, which I personally think is a good thing. I think it's been too much of a grey area over the last 20 years. So to bring it in line with the gas safety, where it's a mandatory test. And the other big piece, which I'm very supportive of, is client money protection. So there's, in the new housing bill going through at the moment, there is a provision in there to make client money protection mandatory for all letting agents, which again I think is an excellent initiative and I'm very supportive of.
Alison?
Yeah, I completely agree. I'd say that we're still trying to find our way in some places through local licensing. And I think that maybe some focusing on agents rather than landlord-specific legislation. But I mean, we've just going through right to rent at the moment. So I don't see anything. I completely agree with the electrical regulations. I think that would probably be in the next maybe 12 to 18 months. But that's a really positive move from our perspective. But I think I think nothing that will fundamentally affect the financials surrounding investment.
Okay, I think we've already got time for one more question. Yes.
Do you think the mandatory licensing of all HMOs will go ahead?
Well, it depends where you are in the country. So in Wales, from the end of this month, all rental property is mandatory licensable. So you cannot rent a property out in Wales from the end of this month unless you have a license. So I think that might be a bit of a test pilot for the UK government to see how that rolls out and how that goes. What's interesting is that this goes live in about a week's time and only 20% of landlords have actually registered for the scheme.
So that question was about HMOs, so houses of multiple occupancy. In Wales, it's everything, is it? Not just
everything,
HMOs?
all rental property.
Okay.
And it has been very, not I'd say that, it's not been very well sort of publicised at all. And actually, to the extent, when we're talking to landlords of property in Wales, it's perceived as maybe something that we're introducing as opposed to proper licensing. So, but I agree. I think it might be testing the water a bit.
Yeah,
that could be quite significant.
Yeah, it could be. But again, the nature of an HMO in itself, actually, depending on where you are with which local authority in the country, is a positive thing. I think if you've got shared accommodation, it should be up to standards, current standards, and in my view, it should be licensed.
Okay, good. Well, thank you very much, panel. I'm not sure when we'll be meeting again. It may be that it's a general election around the corner. Who knows? But thank you very much indeed, everybody in the audience, and thanks for your questions, and thank you everybody at home. And you know, we hope this has helped everybody in their decision making. And good luck to everybody with the property market.